Sarah Martinez never imagined that a simple visit to her husband's military base would transform her from a devoted wife into a woman forced to make the most difficult decision of her life. In a world where love and duty collide with survival and sacrifice, some choices can never be undone. What happens when the person you love most becomes the very person you must save yourself from? This is the story of a woman who discovered that sometimes protecting the ones we love means making choices that will haunt us forever. Sarah Martinez adjusted the rearview mirror one last time before stepping out of her dusty Honda Civic. The military checkpoint ahead looked more intimidating than she remembered from her previous visits. Guard towers stretched toward the cloudless Arizona sky, and armed soldiers moved with practiced precision between the concrete barriers. She smoothed down her floral sundress and checked her reflection in the car window. After 3 months apart, she wanted to look perfect for David. The drive from Phoenix had taken 4 hours, but Sarah had barely noticed the desert landscape rushing past her windows. Her mind was focused entirely on seeing her husband again. David had been stationed at this remote training facility for 6 months now, preparing for his 3rd deployment overseas. Their phone calls had become shorter and less frequent over the past few weeks, and Sarah worried about the distance growing between them. At the main gate, she handed over her identification to a young soldier whose name tag read Williams. His face was serious as he examined her documents and cross-referenced them with his computer screen. Sarah tried to make small talk, mentioning that she was visiting her husband, but the soldier remained focused on his duties. After what felt like an eternity, he handed back her ID and directed her toward the visitor parking area. The base felt different this time. Sarah had visited David at previous assignments, but this place carried an atmosphere she couldn't quite identify. The buildings were newer, more modern, but there was something unsettling about how quiet everything seemed. Usually, military bases buzzed with activity, but here, most of the personnel moved in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. She made her way to the administrative building, where David had told her to meet him. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, smiled warmly when Sarah introduced herself. "Oh, you must be David's wife," she said, her voice carrying a hint of sympathy that Sarah didn't understand. "He's been so excited about your visit. Let me call him for you." While waiting, Sarah observed the people around her. Other military spouses sat in the waiting area, but their expressions seemed strained. Some clutched tissues while others stared blankly at the walls. A few children played quietly with toys, but even they seemed subdued. Sarah began to feel an uncomfortable knot forming in her stomach. When David finally appeared, Sarah's heart both soared and sank. He looked thinner than she remembered, and there were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there during his last leave. But his smile was genuine as he wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against his chest. For a moment, everything felt normal again. "I've missed you so much," David whispered into her hair, and Sarah could hear the exhaustion in his voice. They held each other for several minutes, neither wanting to let go first. When they finally separated, Sarah studied his face more closely. Something was different about his eyes, something she couldn't pinpoint. David led her through a series of hallways she had never seen before. The walls were lined with motivational posters and official notices, but Sarah noticed several areas where it looked like other posters had been recently removed. When she asked about it, David simply said they were updating their displays. They stopped at David's quarters, a small room he shared with another soldier who was currently away on training exercises. The space was spartanly furnished with 2 narrow beds, a small desk, and a few personal belongings. Sarah noticed that David's area was unusually neat, almost obsessively organized. His clothes were folded with military precision, and his few personal items were arranged in perfect lines. As they sat together on his bed, Sarah tried to engage David in conversation about his training and daily routine. His responses were vague and sometimes contradictory. When she asked about his fellow soldiers, David would start to answer enthusiastically, but then stop abruptly, as if remembering something important. The disconnected nature of their conversation began to worry her more than his physical appearance. David suggested they take a walk around the base, and Sarah eagerly agreed, hoping that getting outside would help him relax. As they strolled past various buildings and training areas, David pointed out different facilities and explained their purposes. But Sarah noticed he seemed to avoid certain areas entirely, taking roundabout routes that didn't make logical sense. They passed a large building with no windows and heavy security. Sarah asked what it was used for, but David's expression darkened. "That's classified," he said tersely, then immediately tried to change the subject. But Sarah had caught a glimpse of fear in his eyes when he looked at the building, and it troubled her deeply. During lunch at the base cafeteria, Sarah observed David interacting with other soldiers. While some greeted him normally, others seemed to keep their distance. A few would start to approach their table but then veer away when they noticed Sarah. She began to feel like there were conversations happening around them that she wasn't privy to. One soldier, a young man named Rodriguez, did sit with them briefly. He seemed nervous and kept glancing around as if worried about being overheard. When David excused himself to get more coffee, Rodriguez leaned closer to Sarah and spoke quietly. "Ma'am, I just want you to know that David talks about you all the time. He loves you very much." There was something urgent in his tone, as if he was trying to communicate more than his words conveyed. Before Sarah could respond, David returned, and Rodriguez quickly excused himself. David watched him leave with an expression Sarah couldn't read, then sat down without commenting on the interaction. When Sarah asked about Rodriguez, David said he was a good soldier but had been struggling with the intensity of their current training program. The afternoon brought a tour of some of the training facilities. David showed her obstacle courses, shooting ranges, and equipment storage areas. Sarah was impressed by the sophistication of the technology and the obvious dedication of the personnel. But she also noticed that certain areas were clearly off-limits, marked with signs that warned of restricted access. As evening approached, David seemed to grow more agitated. He checked his watch frequently and kept looking toward the building Sarah had asked about earlier. When she suggested they find somewhere private to talk about their relationship and future plans, David agreed but seemed distracted throughout their conversation. They found a quiet spot near a small garden area behind the administrative building. Sarah tried to discuss their plans for when his current assignment ended, but David's responses were evasive. When she asked directly about his deployment timeline, he said things were complicated and that he couldn't discuss details. The conversation that followed revealed more than David probably intended. Sarah learned that his current training was unlike anything he had experienced before. He mentioned that some soldiers had been transferred out suddenly, and others had requested transfers that were denied. When Sarah asked why, David said he couldn't talk about it, but his body language suggested he was as confused and concerned as she was. As darkness began to fall, David walked Sarah back to the visitor quarters, where she would be staying overnight. The small room was clean but sterile, furnished with basic necessities. David helped her carry in her overnight bag, and they spent a few more hours together, trying to recapture the intimacy they had shared during better times. But even during their most tender moments, Sarah sensed that David was holding something back. When she asked directly if everything was okay, he assured her that he was fine, just tired from intensive training. Yet Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes kept drifting to the window, as if he was watching for something. Before leaving for the night, David held Sarah close and told her how much her visit meant to him. "Tomorrow will be better," he promised, though Sarah wasn't sure what he meant by that. After he left, she lay in the narrow bed staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything she had observed during the day. The base was quiet at night, but not peacefully so. Sarah could hear vehicles moving in the distance and occasional radio chatter from passing patrols. Several times, she heard what sounded like helicopters, but when she looked out the window, she saw nothing. The combination of unfamiliar sounds and her growing concerns about David made sleep nearly impossible. Around midnight, Sarah finally drifted off, but her dreams were filled with images of David looking lost and afraid. In her subconscious mind, she sensed that something significant was about to happen, though she had no way of knowing what form it would take. The stage was set for events that would test every aspect of her character and force her to make choices she never could have imagined. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of shouting outside her window. Her heart raced as she recognized David's voice among those calling out commands in the distance. She quickly dressed and stepped outside, where the cool desert air carried the sounds of what appeared to be an emergency assembly. Soldiers were running towards the central courtyard, their boots echoing against the concrete pathways. She made her way toward the commotion, staying close to the buildings to avoid getting in anyone's way. As she rounded a corner, she saw dozens of soldiers standing in formation while officers moved between the ranks, speaking in urgent tones. Sarah spotted David near the front of one group, his posture rigid with attention, but even from a distance she could see the tension in his stance. An officer she didn't recognize was addressing the assembled troops. His voice carried clearly across the courtyard as he spoke about a security incident and the need for enhanced protocols. Sarah couldn't make out all the details, but she heard references to missing personnel and potential threats to base security. The serious expressions on everyone's faces made it clear this was not a routine drill. When the assembly disbanded, Sarah watched the soldiers disperse in different directions. Some headed toward the dining facility, while others went toward equipment storage areas. David's group was directed toward the mysterious building Sarah had noticed the day before, the one with no windows and heavy security. As he walked away, David turned and spotted her watching from across the courtyard. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Sarah saw something that chilled her to the bone. David looked afraid. Unable to shake her growing unease, Sarah decided to explore more of the base on her own. She'd been given a temporary visitor's pass that allowed her access to most common areas, and she used this freedom to observe the daily operations more closely. What she discovered during her morning walk only deepened her concerns about what was happening at this facility. The first thing she noticed was the unusual security measures. While all military bases maintained strict security, this place seemed to have additional layers of protection that went beyond standard protocols. Guard posts were positioned at intervals that created overlapping fields of observation, and Sarah noticed that certain areas were under constant surveillance by personnel who didn't appear to be regular base security. She made her way to the library, thinking she might learn more about the base's mission through available publications or displays. The facility was well equipped with computers and reference materials, but Sarah noticed that many of the usual military publications and informational brochures were missing. When she asked the librarian about resources describing the base's history and mission, the woman became visibly uncomfortable and suggested that Sarah speak with the Public Affairs Office for such information. At the Public Affairs Office, Sarah's requests for basic information about the facility were met with polite but firm redirection. The officer on duty explained that due to the sensitive nature of current operations, most informational materials were temporarily unavailable. When Sarah mentioned that she was simply trying to better understand her husband's work environment, the officer's expression softened, but his response remained unchanged. Frustrated by the lack of transparency, Sarah decided to visit the base medical facility, thinking she might learn something about David's health and well-being. She had noticed his weight loss and exhaustion, and she wondered if there were medical records that might explain these changes. However, when she arrived at the clinic, she was told that all medical information was confidential and could only be discussed with patients themselves. While waiting in the medical facility's reception area, Sarah struck up a conversation with another visitor, a woman named Carol, whose son was stationed at the base. Carol seemed relieved to have someone to talk to and shared her own concerns about changes she had observed in her son's behavior and attitude. Like David, her son had become more secretive and withdrawn over recent weeks. Carol mentioned that several families had recently received unexpected visits from military officials, meetings that were described as routine check-ins, but felt more like investigations. These visits included questions about family members' mental health history, political affiliations, and any unusual behavior they might have observed. Sarah had not received such a visit, but Carol's description made her wonder if one might be coming. The two women compared notes about their loved ones' recent communications. Both David and Carol's son had become less talkative during phone calls and seemed to carefully consider their words before speaking. They had also both mentioned feeling tired frequently, despite being young, healthy individuals who were accustomed to demanding physical training. After parting ways with Carol, Sarah felt more determined than ever to understand what was happening at the base. She decided to approach some of the younger soldiers, who might be more willing to talk informally. She found several groups taking breaks near the recreational facilities and attempted to engage them in casual conversation. Most of the soldiers were polite but guarded when speaking with her. However, one young man named Thompson seemed particularly nervous when Sarah mentioned she was David's wife. He glanced around quickly before telling her that David was going through a tough time and that she should be patient with him. When Sarah pressed for more details, Thompson excused himself and hurried away. The pattern of evasive responses was becoming clear to Sarah. Everyone she spoke with seemed to know more than they were willing to say. The combination of fear, secrecy, and genuine concern in people's voices convinced her that something serious was affecting the personnel at this facility, including her husband. During lunch, Sarah decided to observe David more carefully. She noticed that he ate very little and seemed to have trouble concentrating on their conversation. When she asked about his training schedule, David provided vague responses that didn't align with what she had observed during her morning exploration. Several times, he seemed to forget what he had just said and would repeat himself or contradict previous statements. Most troubling was David's reaction to certain topics. When Sarah mentioned wanting to visit his family for the holidays, David became agitated and said it might not be possible. When she asked why, he couldn't provide a clear explanation, only saying that his assignment status was uncertain. Sarah had never heard him use such formal language when discussing personal plans. After lunch, David excused himself for what he called a briefing session. Sarah used this time to continue her informal investigation. She positioned herself near the building where David's group had been directed that morning and waited to see what she could learn from observing the personnel coming and going. What she saw disturbed her greatly. Soldiers entering the building appeared normal, but those leaving looked different. Some seemed confused or disoriented, while others appeared unusually calm in a way that seemed artificial. Several individuals she observed leaving the building showed signs of physical exhaustion despite having been inside for only short periods. One soldier stumbled as he exited the building and was immediately assisted by two others who seemed to be waiting for him. Sarah watched as they helped him to a nearby bench and offered him water. The man sat quietly for several minutes, staring straight ahead with an expression that Sarah could only describe as empty. When he finally stood to leave, his movements seemed mechanical, lacking the natural fluidity she expected from a healthy young person. The pattern repeated throughout the afternoon. Groups of soldiers would enter the building, spend varying amounts of time inside, and emerge showing signs of confusion, exhaustion, or unusual behavioral changes. Sarah began to understand why David had looked afraid when he was directed toward this facility. As evening approached, Sarah positioned herself where she could observe David's group when they finished their session. When the door finally opened, she immediately spotted her husband among those exiting. David moved slowly, as if he was having trouble maintaining his balance. His usual confident posture was gone, replaced by an uncertain, almost fearful demeanor. Sarah waited until David was away from the other soldiers before approaching him. When she called his name, he turned toward her, but his reaction was delayed, as if he was having trouble processing her voice. His eyes, which had always been bright and alert, now seemed clouded and unfocused. "David, are you okay?" Sarah asked, reaching out to touch his arm. His skin felt cold despite the warm evening air, and she noticed a slight tremor in his hands. When he spoke, his voice sounded different, flatter and more monotone than usual. "I'm fine, Sarah," David replied, but the words sounded rehearsed rather than genuine. "The training is just very intensive. I need to rest now." He started walking toward his quarters without waiting for her response, his gait unsteady and mechanical. Sarah followed him, growing more concerned with each step. When they reached his room, David sat heavily on his bed and stared at the wall. Sarah tried to engage him in conversation, but his responses were minimal and often didn't seem to connect with her questions. It was as if she was talking to a different person, someone wearing David's face but lacking his personality and warmth. The most frightening moment came when Sarah mentioned a shared memory from their honeymoon. David looked at her blankly for several seconds before saying, "I don't remember that." The memory in question was significant to both of them, something they had often talked about and laughed over. For David to have no recollection of it seemed impossible.
As the evening progressed, Sarah began to document David's unusual behaviors and responses.
She pretended to be checking messages on her phone while actually taking notes about his condition. The pattern that emerged was deeply troubling. David seemed to have lost access to many of his personal memories while retaining basic functional abilities and military training knowledge. When Sarah tested this theory by asking about other shared experiences, she found that David's memory problems were selective but extensive. He remembered his basic identity and military service but seemed to have lost much of his emotional connection to their relationship and personal history. It was as if someone had carefully removed specific types of memories while leaving others intact. The realization of what might be happening to David hit Sarah like a physical blow. The secretive building, the strange behaviors she had observed, the fear in other personnel's eyes, and now David's selective memory loss all pointed towards something that seemed impossible to believe. Yet the evidence was mounting that her husband was being subjected to some form of experimental treatment or conditioning. That night, as David slept fitfully beside her in the narrow visitor's bed, Sarah lay awake planning her next moves. She knew she needed more concrete evidence of what was happening, but she also realized that time might be running out. If David was being subjected to treatments that were affecting his memory and personality, each day could mean further damage to the man she loved. The question that haunted her through the long night was whether she could find a way to help David escape whatever was being done to him, or if she was already too late to save the person he used to be. As dawn approached, Sarah made a decision that would set in motion the events that would ultimately force her to make the most difficult choice of her life. Sarah's plan began before sunrise. While David slept deeply beside her, she carefully slipped out of bed and dressed quietly in dark clothing. Her goal was to gather concrete evidence of what was happening at the facility, starting with the mysterious windowless building that seemed to be the center of the disturbing activities she had witnessed. The base was quieter at this early hour, with only essential personnel on duty. Sarah had studied the patrol patterns during her previous day's observations and identified a brief window when the area around the secured building would have minimal surveillance. She understood the risks of her actions, but the gradual disappearance of her husband's personality and memories compelled her to take desperate measures. Moving carefully through the shadows between buildings, Sarah approached the restricted facility from its least monitored side. The structure was larger than it appeared from a distance, stretching back much further than she had realized. External ventilation systems hummed quietly, and she noticed that the building's power consumption must be enormous based on the heavy electrical cables she could see running into the structure. Finding a service entrance that appeared to be less heavily monitored than the main doors, Sarah discovered that her visitor's access card could open certain lower security entrances, probably an oversight in the facility's security programming. The door opened with a soft electronic beep and she slipped inside, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would give away her presence. The interior of the building was unlike anything Sarah had expected. Instead of the typical military facility layout, she found herself in what resembled a high-tech medical complex. The hallways were lined with rooms containing sophisticated equipment she didn't recognize, and computer terminals displayed streams of data that meant nothing to her untrained eye. As she moved deeper into the facility, Sarah began to hear voices coming from various rooms. Through partially open doors, she caught glimpses of personnel in white coats working with complex machinery. In one room, she saw what appeared to be monitoring equipment similar to what might be found in a sleep study clinic, with multiple screens displaying brainwave patterns and other biological data. The breakthrough came when Sarah found an unattended computer terminal that had not been properly secured. The screen displayed what appeared to be a patient database, with names, photos, and detailed records of various individuals. Sarah's blood ran cold when she scrolled down and found David's name on the list. According to the file, David was identified as Subject 247 inches in something called Project Mindbridge. The record contained detailed information about his physical condition, psychological profile, and response to various treatments. What Sarah read made her feel physically sick. The project appeared to involve experimental procedures designed to modify memory, personality, and behavioral patterns in military personnel. David's file indicated that he had been undergoing treatments for several weeks. The records documented progressive changes in his memory retention, emotional responses, and cognitive function. Most disturbing were the notes indicating that the treatments were designed to make subjects more compliant and mission-focused while reducing their emotional attachments to personal relationships and civilian life. Sarah quickly used her phone to photograph as many pages as possible, though she knew she was risking everything by doing so. The documents revealed that dozens of soldiers were involved in the project and that the treatments had varying degrees of success. Some subjects showed the desired behavioral modifications, while others experienced severe adverse effects including memory loss, personality fragmentation, and in some cases, complete psychological breakdown. One document that particularly caught her attention was a communication between the project director and higher military officials. The message discussed the potential for expanding the program if the current phase proved successful. It also mentioned concerns about maintaining operational security and managing family member inquiries about changes in subject behavior. As Sarah continued reading, she discovered that the project had multiple phases. The early stages involved psychological conditioning and drug treatments designed to increase suggestibility. Later phases included more invasive procedures that could permanently alter brain function. According to David's treatment schedule, he was approaching the transition to a more advanced phase that would likely cause irreversible changes to his personality and memory. The sound of approaching footsteps forced Sarah to quickly close the computer terminal and hide behind a nearby equipment cart. Two technicians entered the area, discussing preparations for the day's sessions. Sarah listened carefully as they talked about enhanced protocols being implemented due to timeline pressures from above. The conversation suggested that the project was being accelerated, which meant David and the other subjects would face more intensive treatment sooner than originally planned. After the technicians moved on, Sarah continued her exploration, now with a much clearer understanding of what she was looking for. She found several rooms that appeared to be treatment chambers, equipped with what looked like modified medical equipment. In one room, she discovered restraint systems and monitoring devices that confirmed her worst fears about the nature of the procedures being conducted. Most horrifying was a room that contained detailed video recordings of treatment sessions. Sarah watched in horror as she saw soldiers she recognized being subjected to various procedures while restrained and apparently sedated. The recordings showed the gradual transformation of vibrant, thinking individuals into passive, compliant subjects who responded to commands without question or emotion. One recording showed David from several days earlier. Sarah watched her husband being subjected to procedures that involved both psychological manipulation and what appeared to be targeted electrical stimulation of specific brain regions. The David in the video gradually became less responsive and more mechanical in his reactions as the session progressed. By the end of the recording, he showed the same empty, confused expression Sarah had observed in him the previous evening. The evidence Sarah had gathered painted a clear picture of an illegal and deeply unethical program that was systematically destroying the minds and personalities of soldiers under the guise of military training. She understood now that David's strange behavior, memory loss, and personality changes were not side effects of intensive training, but deliberate results of experimental procedures designed to create programmable human weapons. As Sarah prepared to leave the facility, she encountered her first real crisis. A security guard making an unexpected patrol round discovered her presence in a restricted area. The young soldier seemed as surprised as Sarah was, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Sarah recognized him as Rodriguez, the soldier who had briefly sat with them at lunch the previous day. "Ma'am, you can't be in here," Rodriguez said quietly, his voice filled with conflict rather than authority. "This area is strictly off-limits to visitors." But Sarah could see in his eyes that he understood why she was there, and more importantly, that he sympathized with her situation. "I know what they're doing to David," Sarah whispered, showing Rodriguez one of the photographs she had taken. "And I think you know too." Rodriguez glanced at the image and his face went pale. For several long moments, he struggled with his duty as a soldier versus his conscience as a human being. Finally, Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. "You have maybe 10 minutes before the next security sweep," he told Sarah. "There's something else you need to see, but then you have to get out of here and never come back." He led her to a different section of the building, one that contained files on all the soldiers involved in the project. What Rodriguez showed Sarah was evidence that several soldiers had died during the experimental procedures, their deaths covered up as training accidents. Others had suffered permanent brain damage and had been quietly transferred to long-term medical facilities. The project had a much higher casualty rate than the official records indicated, and David was scheduled for procedures that had proven fatal to previous subjects. "They're going to do something to David tomorrow that they've never tried before," Rodriguez explained, his voice shaking with emotion. "The previous attempts at this level of treatment killed 2 soldiers last week. I can't officially do anything to stop it, but I thought you should know." He handed Sarah a schedule showing that David was set for Phase 4 implementation the following morning. Rodriguez also revealed that he and several other soldiers had been trying to document the abuses taking place at the facility, but their efforts had been discovered, and they were now under suspicion themselves. "They're probably going to put me in the program next," he said. "I've been asking too many questions, and they don't trust soldiers who think too much." Armed with this devastating information, Sarah knew she had to act quickly. Rodriguez helped her leave the building without being detected, but both of them understood that her discovery would not remain secret for long. The computer system would log her access to the files, and security cameras throughout the facility had recorded her movements. Sarah returned to her quarters knowing that she had very little time to decide on her next course of action. The evidence she had gathered was more than enough to expose the illegal program, but she also knew that taking it public would require time she didn't have. David was scheduled for a potentially fatal procedure in less than 24 hours. The options available to her were all dangerous and potentially hopeless. She could try to contact authorities outside the base, but the project clearly had high-level military support, and there was no guarantee that external intervention would arrive in time. She could attempt to remove David from the facility, but as a civilian with no military authority, her chances of success were minimal. As Sarah weighed her choices, she received an unexpected visitor. Carol, the mother of another soldier in the program, knocked on her door with tears in her eyes. "They took my son this morning for emergency treatment," she said. "The doctors say he had a reaction to his medications, but I think something went wrong with whatever they've been doing to him." Carol's son had been found unconscious in his quarters, and the medical staff refused to provide details about his condition. "I think he tried to resist whatever they were doing to him," Carol explained. "Last time I talked to him, he said he was starting to remember things they had made him forget, and he was scared about what they might do to stop that from happening." The conversation with Carol crystallized Sarah's understanding of her situation. The project was not just experimental but actively dangerous to anyone who showed signs of resistance or recovery. If David's natural resilience or their emotional connection was helping him retain some of his original personality, the project administrators would view him as a failure that needed to be corrected through more drastic measures. That evening, when David returned from his daily sessions, Sarah could see that his condition had deteriorated further. He seemed to have even less recognition of her, and his responses to her questions were increasingly mechanical and emotionless. Most alarming was that he kept referring to her as the visitor rather than using her name, as if their personal relationship had been erased from his memory. As they sat together for what Sarah realized might be their last evening as husband and wife, she made the most difficult decision of her life. She could not save David through official channels or external intervention. The only way to protect him from the fatal procedure scheduled for the next morning was to remove him from the facility herself, regardless of the consequences. The plan that formed in Sarah's mind was desperate and dangerous, but she could see no alternative. She would have to find a way to get David away from the base and to safety, knowing that such an action would likely be viewed as kidnapping a soldier and could result in her arrest or worse. But as she looked at the empty shell that had once been her vibrant, loving husband, Sarah knew she had no choice but to try. Sarah's escape plan required precise timing and a considerable amount of luck. She spent the night memorizing the base layout, guard rotations, and vehicle locations while David slept fitfully beside her. His sleep was troubled, filled with mumbling and restless movements that suggested his subconscious mind was still fighting against the modifications being imposed on his consciousness. At 3 a.m, Sarah began implementing her plan. She had identified a window of opportunity during the early morning shift change when security would be briefly reduced in certain areas. Her goal was to reach David's quarters, convince him to leave with her, and make it to her car before anyone discovered their absence.